Welcome to the Strengthening Communities of Support to Serve Immigrant Clients webinar, presented by the American Psychological Association. Thank you so much for joining us. APA is delighted to bring you the third and final part of this special webinar in which the presenters address strategies for building communities of support when providing mental health services to immigrants, including DACA recipients. Let's begin with a few housekeeping notes. At this time, all lines are muted. If you require technical support, please submit questions with the Tech Support tab, which you find on the right side of your screen, not to be confused with the Q&A tab. You should be able to see the slides live. If you experience technical issues, please try to 1. Refresh your browser window, or 2. Try a different browser. If you are behind a corporate security wall that has not approved this website for access, please contact your technical support team. To view the slides in full screen, just click the screen icon next to Live on the lower right side of the slide and press Escape to exit the full screen. To access the PDF file of today's slides, scroll to the bottom of your screen and click on the link under the Handouts tab section. We do encourage you to submit questions about today's topic through the QA tab, Q&A Questions tab, on the right side of your screen throughout the presentation. Questions will be answered during the last 15 to 20 minutes of the webinar. Due to time constraints, we will not be able to answer all questions. If you would like to re-watch this session, a recording will be available within 5 to 7 business days of the original air date. You will be able to access it from your course dashboard. To obtain the 1.5 APA continuing education credits offered for this webinar, you must click OK when you see the attendance verification box appear on your screen during the webinar. All you need to do is click OK. Remember to respond to all attendance verifications that you do see. You must complete a webinar evaluation, so please stay on through the conclusion of the webinar, and you will see a pop-up appear on your screen with access to the evaluation. A CE certificate will be emailed to you, and you will also be available for download in your course dashboard. Should you have any questions about continuing education credits, please email cpe@apa.org. We have the privilege of having Congressman Raul Ruiz introducing today's program. Congressman Ruiz represents the 36th District of California and has been active in his ongoing support of immigrants and DACA recipients. He will then be followed by today's presenters.
Hello and welcome. I'm Congressman Raul Ruiz, and I am an emergency physician with Humanitarian and Disaster Aid Training, and I represent California's 36th Congressional District. It is a pleasure to be here today with you to provide a few introductory remarks for this very important webinar, Strengthening Communities of Support to Serve Immigrant Clients. I want to start by thanking the American Psychological Association for holding this webinar. I also want to thank all of the sponsor organizations who have made this event possible. Thank you. National Latinx Psychological Association, Society of Counseling Psychology, Lehigh College of Education, FWD.US, Informed Immigrant, United We Dream, and Immigrants Rising. Psychologists are needed now more than ever as anxiety, depression, and mental illness are on the rise due to the global pandemic. As an emergency physician, I understand how essential it is to know the strategies for building communities of support when providing mental health services to individuals, especially immigrants. Even before COVID-19, many immigrants experienced trauma in their journey to the United States or prior to leaving their homes. That trauma has only been magnified by the global pandemic we are now experiencing. Immigrants are essential to the United States, its economy, and its recovery from the pandemic. There are an estimated 27,000 DACA healthcare workers who are needed in the fight against COVID-19. Now, as infections continue to climb and financial turmoil worsens, we need policies that will protect access to resources like testing for immigrants, including mental health treatment. But instead, over the past months and years, we have seen anti-immigrant policies that are harmful not only to immigrants, but also to the millions of Americans that support and provide services to. Some of these recent detrimental policies include trying to rescind DACA, attempting to limit multiple forms of immigration, including through education, mostly recently for international students, and keeping children confined in detention facilities at a time when social distancing can literally be life-saving. It's important to know that many of us in Congress are working hard to protect the human rights of immigrants. Last year, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 6, the American Dream and Promise Act of 2019. The House also passed legislation I introduced, H.R. 3239, the Humanitarian Standards for Individuals in Customs and Border Protection Custody Act, which would establish baseline standards of care requiring the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency to meet the fundamental humanitarian needs of children, seniors, women, and families in its custody. There are many of us fighting hard in Congress for immigrants, and we will continue to do so. But we could not do it without all of you and your critically important work. As psychologists, your voices and expertise are especially important during this time when mental health concerns are on the rise. Many of you live in cities where members of Congress have home state offices that conduct virtual or in-person meetings with staff or the member themselves. So please use your voice to advocate for the voiceless. This webinar will include DACA recipients and providers who will share their perspectives and help connect you with the resources to get through COVID-19 and beyond. If you are a provider with clients who are immigrants, including DACA recipients, this webinar will teach you useful strategies to help them. And if you are an immigrant or DACA recipient yourself, you will hear about resources useful to you and your family. With that, I want to thank you again for all your hard work and for participating in this very important webinar. I will now turn it over to the speakers.
Thank you very much to Congressman Ortiz for this introduction and reminding us all why we need this webinar and this kind of education. Welcome to all. Welcome to this very last webinar in the APA series, Social Cultural Competencies, where DACA recipients, effects of anti-immigrant policy in the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Germán Cadenas. I'm an assistant professor of counseling psychology. And I am glad to be here today facilitating this webinar. I would like to start by sharing a little bit about my background. I am an immigrant myself and permanently undocumented. I was undocumented for about 9 years. At that time, I became involved in immigrant rights. Then I went to where I did clinical work for 2 years. Today by the next personal and professional experience.
Germán, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Germán. We are having difficulty hearing you, and not sure if it's an adjustment on your phone that you can make to get closer, or if you may need to call back.
Isn't better?
Not much, I'm sorry.
Okay, so how about we begin with the introductions from the speakers, and I will go back.
Sounds good.
So I will ask the speakers to share what brings them to this work.
Hi, everyone. I think we're going to just go ahead and move through some introductions. I know Germán was introducing himself a little bit, so hopefully he can jump back in and resume that. Hi, everyone. My name is Liliana Campos. I'm a mental health advocate with Immigrants Rising, a nonprofit organization that works directly with immigrant and undocumented youth in California. I am also a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology at the University of San Francisco, and I am an immigrant of Mexico. I crossed the border to the U.S. when I was 7 years old, and over the last 10 plus years, I have been dedicating myself to implementing community organizing and activism strategies in mental health practices and really further expand that relationship between how community organizing and activism work in and of itself can be healing, but how do we transform the field of psychology as a sanctuary place for undocumented and immigrant communities. So with that said, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Marita, who can share more about themselves.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Marita. My pronouns are she, they. I am a graphic artist by trade. I just graduated from UC Berkeley with a bachelor's in American Studies with an emphasis in visual culture and media. I am also a proud member of the undocumented community and the queer community as well. And I am really excited to share with you my journey and how mental health has really fueled my academic, my design, and my community work.
I guess that leaves me. My name's Manuel. I'm second year now in the PhD Clinical Counseling Psychology program at Utah State. Made it through my first year, so happy about that. I'm originally from Guadalajara, Mexico, but I was raised for like 20 years in California, so pretty much my whole life. And I will share more about what got me interested in psychology and wanting to work with undocumented people later on. But just as a summary, I'm very interested in trying to advocate for the well-being of undocumented people by using psychology.
Thank you all for those introductions. Can you hear me better now?
I'm going to try putting you on the camera, Germán. We're having trouble with your phone audio.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead and try and speak, please. We're still not hearing you that way either. You're back live on the microphone on the phone. Very faintly, very, very faintly.
Can you hear me now?
A little bit. I've picked up your volume as well.
Can we try the computer again?
So, is there someone that can step in maybe for Germán at this point? Anna, if you would, please, if you'd like.
Yes, so I'm going to go ahead and try my best to just step in and try to guide us through the initial slides. So I'm going to, let's see, looks like I can manage this. So hopefully we'll get Germán back. He has definitely been leading us a lot into this work and in the presentation. So hopefully we can get the technology to work with us. So again, here we have the amazing sponsors. Thank you so much to everybody. Thank you to each and all of you for showing up today and really committing yourselves to expanding your knowledge and your practice. I'm sure many of you are already experts in working with immigrant and documented communities. And really, one of the goals that we have for today is really being able to understand the context of immigration policy as it intersects with COVID-19 and the impact that, both of these intersecting issues are having in our community. Additionally, we would like to be able to talk about, and I know that in the previous webinars, there's been a lot of discussions around trauma-informed care services for communities that are impacted by our immigration system, but further develop psychotherapy strategies to foster resilience and resist trauma among immigrant communities. Also strengthen communities of support to serve immigrant clients. If you haven't checked out the guide to providing mental health services to immigrants impacted by the changes to DACA and the COVID-19 pandemic, I definitely encourage you. You can download it at www.informedimmigrant.org, and you'll see a number of various recommendations that a group of us developed in order to that influenced really a lot of the content that you'll see here. So again, a lot of what we'll be discussing today is really drawing from the diversity and the multidimensionality spectrum that we see across the 11 million undocumented community members that make up this community. More specifically, some of the content that we'll be discussing today is really referencing the many identities and experiences among the 1.5 undocumented generation, right? The research, as some of you will know, really identifies this community as many members who may have immigrated to the U.S. at a young age, many individuals who may identify themselves as dreamers, many individuals who may be eligible for DACA. And while that's true, we also want to highlight that there is so much outside of that, right? A lot of the community members that we're also trying to access and reach out to may not be eligible to DACA. So one of the things that we definitely encourage everybody in this webinar is to also think about the many different community members that may not be eligible for DACA. So,
Judy, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you stepping in, and big apologies for the technology issues. Major apologies. I think I'll take it from here. We want to, again, thank you all for being here today. We're very excited to bring this webinar to you, and thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to all the organizations, the immigrant rights organizations that helped us put together this webinar, and thank you to the APA and Congressman Ruiz for reminding us of the context and why this kind of training and education is needed. We wanted to let everyone in the audience know that the National Latinx Ecological Association, Nlpa, and United We Dream are partnering to create a mental health directory to provide pro bono or low bono services to undocumented immigrants. And we're trying to recruit as many providers as possible to join this directory. So if anyone is interested in more information about how to become part of this, please email anyone on this slide here so that we can hopefully get you signed up for the directory. And this is to provide services to undocumented communities that need it the most right now. Okay, so today we'll be speaking about different ways of strengthening communities of support for undocumented immigrants and DACA recipients. And we have a couple of sections for you today. The first one will be reviewing a couple of models from the academic community and also from the practice community. On the second part, we will be sharing some community resources and some ways in which community-based work can be healing and really positive for undocumented immigrants. And then in the last part, we'll be reviewing models of professional support and resources of professional support for providers who are working with immigrant communities. And so to begin, I would like to quickly review some of the recommendations from the APA Immigration Task Force. I remember that when I started my graduate studies and I was undocumented, it was a little bit overwhelming to know that there wasn't as much literature on undocumented communities and on immigrant communities back then. But in the last decade or so, the academic community, the practice communities have really stepped up and developed models, have published articles to help guide the field in how to work with undocumented immigrants and immigrant communities. And one of those examples is the excellent report from the APA Immigration Task Force. And these are their guiding principles. In the beginning, 2 webinars, we went over evidence-based practice and culturally competent practice with immigrants. We specifically talked about trauma-informed care, social justice competencies, multicultural competencies. So we'll let you review those first 2 webinars on your own. Today we'll focus more on the next 3 guiding principles. And the first one is using an ecological framework when working with the immigrant community. And what it means to use an ecological framework is understanding that immigrants do not, or anyone really, exists in isolation from systems around them, but rather that immigrants are in relationship and exist in interaction with multiple systems. So the family system, the system of peer and friendship support, school, education, work employment systems, community organizations, cultural, social, political forces that all shape the mental health and the experiences, right, the reality that our immigrant communities live day to day. So as practitioners, it may benefit us from approaching our work using this ecological perspective. And the next piece is about a social justice perspective. And what this means is that as practitioners, we, and scholars and educators, we try to achieve and really affirm the human rights of our clients. We try to support our clients in their socio-political empowerment, in seeking equity, and we stay away, we avoid any practices that reinforce social inequities and health disparities in our communities, or any practices that cause harm. And instead, we approach our work with a social justice perspective. And then the last piece is about comprehensive community-based services, and we'll provide some examples for what that looks like today. I also want to note the recommendations that we wrote in 2018 as part of the California Ecological Association, which again embraced this work in an ecological way, in a social justice way. And these recommendations begin with trying to find a framework to help us understand the experiences of people who are marginalized. And for me, a framework that is very helpful is liberation psychology. And it really helps me understand oppression and mental health in relation to oppression. And you can see here that many of these recommendations are about continuing to obtain education, continuing to explore implicit biases, to continue to explore our own attitudes, and eventually engaging in institutional, community, and policy advocacy to support undocumented immigrant communities. I also wanted to quickly mention this framework that I find extremely helpful. This is the HEART framework, the Healing Ethno-Racial Trauma model, created by Chavez Dueñas, Adames, Perez Chavez, and Salas, published in 2019, and it provides basically 4 steps for working with clients who have experienced trauma. And the first one being trying to establish sanctuary. So as providers, we might think, how can we as providers provide sanctuary to our clients through our practice and through the institutions where we work? Many universities have become sanctuary campuses. Many cities have become sanctuary cities. Spiritual places have become sanctuary churches and so on. And how can we as a profession become sanctuary? And then this framework goes into specific strategies for addressing trauma, into strategies for building and strengthening community, and eventually it goes into strategies for liberation and how engaging in activism and social justice kind of work can be part of the healing process. And it can actually be a very healthy thing for undocumented individuals to engage in this kind of work. So to bring all of this to life a little bit more with an example, I really appreciate the Undocumented Student Program at UC Berkeley. I think it's a model for how universities can provide services to undocumented students and in a holistic way. And the program is completely embedded within the undocumented immigrant community. There on that campus, they have one of the largest undocumented immigrant student bodies in the country. And they are able to provide academic services, guidance to financial aid, career development programming. They're also able to offer mental health services as part of their model, which includes not only individual one-on-one counseling, but also group counseling, healing spaces, psychoeducational workshops, collaboration with other units, collaboration with psychiatry, the health center, providers in the community. And in addition, they're able to provide legal services completely free to students who need to renew their DACA or students who need to explore other avenues, other legal options. So again, I think this is a really good model for how universities could provide this comprehensive, social justice-oriented, community-based services to our undocumented community. So with that, I'll hand it over to Lily, who will talk to us about models based on the community based agencies and nonprofit services. Lily, I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
Pardon me. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so I will definitely be referencing or placing this in the context of the ecological model, right? The community-based psychological model as well, right? And a lot of this is also coming from some of the personal experiences that I had that I'm currently having as a mental health advocate with Immigrants Rising, having formerly been undocumented for over 27 years until about 2 years ago, but also having stepped into this community organizing work when the Federal DREAM Act did not pass. And this was about, 13 years ago. And so at that time, there was a huge push, right, to get individuals to really develop their stories, not only as a way of advocacy and activism, but really as an opportunity to build a lot of the critical consciousness process that we know can be incredibly healing and radical, right, and transforming these very much systems of oppression that we're speaking to, but also transforming our own psychological understanding of how these systems impact our own wellness. So through that came a lot of re-traumatization that was happening and telling our stories, right? And so really within community organizations, immigrants' rights community organizations that are focusing a lot in building stories and building advocacy and building activism, there's been a huge push also to be able to incorporate mental healing within the community, right? But also be able to uplift the professional knowledge that is coming from within the community, right? The professional identities that we know exist. So really being able to create platforms where individuals, where licensed clinicians, licensed mental health clinicians are also collaborating together with our community members to uplift the stories, but also uplift it in a way where the theories and the practice are coming out of the community. I think with that, it's important to acknowledge, right, that a lot of the times, even in the world of psychology, we talk about these mental health practices and interventions as if some of us, might not be impacted, right, by these very exact systems. So I think one of the powerful things about these webinars and about these discussions and collaborations is being able to really strengthen that intersectionality, right, and really being able to highlight that that when we're talking about undocumented community members, we may also be talking about our clinician who is impacted by these very much issues that we're talking about. So again, right, how do we build programming and theories that are culturally inclusive, and really being the goal within community organizations that can extend out to even the intra-training that happens across different programs within a nonprofit organization, such as with Immigrants Rising, for example, we have a legal services team, we have an entrepreneurial team, right? We have an educational team, and now we're building the mental health programming that really has taken about 10 years for it to even come to a point of being able to deliver services, which I'll reference a little bit of it in just a bit. But really, again, right, how do we collaborate within programming that is already existing and really extend that mental health knowledge, education, and resources. Next slide, please. Do I move the slide, or can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you so much.
Can you see it? Yes.
Yes, sorry, there was a little bit of a delay on my end.
Okay.
So by collaborating with community members and having licensed clinicians or practitioners and healers come in, we're really reducing some of the stigma, right, that we know exists among our community, and that being lack of trust, not just in clinical psychology or psychology and healing itself, but in medical services. So how do we create that trust in a way that feels also empowering to our community? So being able to develop education by promoting mental health, about the experiences of our community, right, and healing strategies that the community is already theorizing and developing, right? So again, right, when we talk about trauma, we also equally need to be talking about the ancestral wisdom and knowledge and resistance that comes in the daily interactions that individuals have across the systems, where a lot of advocacy is required. So really being able to draw from that. Some examples, at least in Immigrants Rising, and I know United We Dream, Informed Immigrant, and many other national and local immigrant rights organizations are doing, are the drop-in support groups. And we have definitely seen an increase in this, right, during COVID-19. And I think going virtually and even being able to offer a lot of these drop-in support groups or educational support groups has been incredibly significant to our community, right? In addition to building community, but really expanding and understanding about different stressors that could lead to, chronic stress, anxiety, depression, and trauma. And then, of course, being able to understand how the sociocultural and sociopolitical factors are contributing to that. Another example could be a group or community support group that is more intimate, more confidential, right? And I'm also highlighting these examples, you know, in thinking about community organizations that may not identify themselves as mental health organizations that are directly delivering mental health services to folks. Because I know there's like a lot of bureaucratic and ethical things to consider, but how can we also create these mental health practices outside of that and within our scope of work? So again, these are some examples. Next slide, please. So like I said, I'm not going to go too much into this because I know this was extensively discussed in the previous webinar, but at least for Immigrants Rising, like I said, it has taken us some time to really incorporate a lot of trauma-informed care practices, and it required a lot of research on our end and also collaboration and consulting with clinicians in the community, and really being able to identify also a community member who can also speak to these experiences from a personal perspective was foundational. So a combination of two has really allowed, again, for the community to be able to connect to mental health services and possibly as a first step into considering therapeutic services, like in the format of psychotherapy, for example. A lot of what happens through some of the work that we're doing is that we're really just talking to folks and really destigmatizing a lot of the mental health attitudes and experiences that people have had, right? They're, you know, for many of them, very fairly so. So I think a lot of what happens through the mental health advocacy and also working in collaboration with clinicians is really being able to model a lot of that. Next slide, please. And I think I'll go ahead and end with this and really being able to, again, right, I don't think that we can emphasize enough the importance of resilience and being able to create programming and opportunities where individuals can also celebrate their various identities and various experiences that may be informed by their immigration status and may be also outside of it, right? And so with that, being able to create dialogues where we're talking about intersecting issues, we're talking about intersecting identities and experiences, and be able to draw from cultural experiences and beliefs and attitudes that we know exist within the community and we know are feeling for the community. So one example is being also able to talk and address the colonial trauma that that is very much related to immigration, and it's very much related to citizenship and deserving. And so being able to explore those factors and really create spaces of process and reflection and raising awareness can be incredibly liberating for folks as well as clinicians. So with that, I will go ahead and end this part of it and move on to the next slide to be able to talk a little bit more about how we've been able to even further strengthen the practice of connecting individuals to community resources. And so I'm so happy to introduce my colleague and my friend, Marita Quiroz, who will share more about her experiences around this.
Thank you so much. Can I get a thumbs up? I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me okay? Okay, great. I was really excited to participate in this webinar because in many ways I have benefited from all of the programs that Immigrants Rising, and especially the Undocumented Student program at Berkeley, has created. I participated in one-on-one. I benefited from one-on-one counseling, group sharing, and so many other different modalities of mental health. I want to highlight, can we go to the, oh yeah, we are in that slide. That is, I am very proud to have participating in this panel with other members of the undocumented community about how we started our journey through mental health. This was a very powerful gathering that we had, and we just noticed that each one of us had was looking for something very particular in a therapist. So that was really interesting to me. What was important to me to find in a therapist may not apply to somebody else. So this is a very powerful video that we created. The link is there, and then I have the opportunity to include a lot of my drawings in the video. So yeah, I would invite you to look at this video. Next slide, please. So this is the part that I'm most excited about. I love the power of story, and in this section I would very excited to share a little bit more about my background, about what it was like for me to look for mental health resources for the first time, and also how it all translated to a new passion for storytelling and doodles and drawings, and how I started incorporating my design background and start expressing and telling my journey about mental health with drawing. And then the last part, I think it's an important one, that my story goes beyond DACA. I never really qualified for DACA, and many of you might be wondering why I'm doing here. So, but I will definitely explain that later. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Mexico, and I lived there for the first 17 years of my life. Then I moved to the U.S. with my parents, and I have lived in the U.S. for 23 years. I started looking for mental health resources when I was 28 years old, and that's really when my first panic attack happened. I didn't really know what to call it. When I described it to a friend, she suggested that I look for a therapist. She didn't really tell me much more than that. She didn't really go into the process of what that meant. I had never contemplated therapy before, and I did not know what to expect. I didn't know how therapy could help me. But at that point, I believe that the panic attacks had become so frequent and so severe that I was willing to try anything. So I started seeing a therapist twice a week. Also, there's no coincidence that that same year that I experienced my first panic attack is when my visa expired. And that year I started really grappling with a new identity, of my status. I started really dealing with what it meant to live with an undocumented status in the U.S. I also was not able to visit my family in Mexico. When I had my visa, I was able to go back 3 times and visit my family and friends. But when I was 28, that opportunity stopped, and I haven't been able to see my family since 2003. The topic of immigration didn't come up until 6 or 7 months later. My therapist never pressed the subject. They didn't question why I paid cash instead of a credit card. They didn't question my lack of health insurance. They didn't question my accent or what I was from, and I really appreciated that. I didn't know what my therapist's level of awareness was back then, but my therapist intimidated me, and I was able to express all the assumptions that I had of them I saw them as someone who had access to everything that was kept from me: affluence, mobility, support, access to higher education, a career, a job. But my assumptions were received without judgment and without any clarification. At that point, it was clear to me that the process, it was the point of this was for me to process that, but for them not to defend their position. So when I finally disclosed my status, I asked my therapist not to call me a dreamer. It's something that is a very personal choice. I realized that the term did not fit me, and it may fit others, but not me. It brought up images of young, perfect students, and I'm not young and far from perfect. So, but then something very incredible started happening. After every therapy session, I would get on the bus to go home, and I was so tired of talking at that point that I started drawing my reflections from therapy. So I started engaging in what I call meditative doodling. I just started doodling and Post-it notes. Can we move to the next slide, please? So what you see here is a slide from one of the first comic strips that I made. At that point, I didn't have access to higher education, so I started drawing about achievements outside of academia, things that I was very proud of. So I narrated my moments of joy, and in this case, it was finishing my first marathon. Next slide, please. As you can see, my drawing abilities were very, very limited. But what doodling helped was help me visualize my story in a new way, and it made me really appreciate what I was doing every day. In this slide, for example, I was going to community college, and I could only afford one class at a time. So I mapped out the public transportation that I had to take just to get to school and take one class. So, so as you can see, it really helped me zoom out and understand, understand my story in a new way. Next slide, please. Drawing also helped me map out different processes and start looking at, start framing my setbacks in a different way, and start looking at them with humor and curiosity. In this case, for example, in order for me to take a graphics design class, I had to learn how to touch type. So as you can see, it took me a little while to get there. But it was a matter of, I usually tell people I just learned graphic design, but I wanted to show also the steps that it took for me to even get there. It's important to mention that it took me 6 years of therapy before I started looking for community. I finished this comic strip, and I started using it as a way to introduce myself to other nonprofit organizations. I found websites and personal stories and videos of undocumented young people thriving and finding different ways to tell their stories, just like I was. So I reached out, and I found immigrant-serving actually online, and I sent them this particular comic strip. Next slide, please. So I sent them my comic strip, and then a year later, I quit my job in LA, and I moved to the Bay Area, and they invited me to start facilitating visual storytelling workshops and sharing my process with other students. Next slide, please. And then my work extended outside of the Bay Area. This is a photo of a group of students from the Scholarship Foundation in St. Louis. I was invited to facilitate a workshop as well. We brainstormed, we worked on storyboards, and then this group of students drew and digitized their stories. And earlier this year, they had an art exhibit called Project Know Us in the Missouri History Museum, where many of them shared their stories in public for the first time. I am really nervous about flying because of my status, but I knew that I couldn't miss this opportunity, so I flew there to be with them. Next slide, please. I really love this guide. I know that it's been brought up before in this series, but I just want to really acknowledge how amazing there's so much here that I just agree with so many with all the practices that they're mentioned, because all of them have proved successful in my work with my therapist and as a facilitator, treating my story as unique, creating safe spaces for sharing and listening, and with an open mind and heart, I think has been really important. Becoming familiar with policy and with real life stories is those are really great starting points. But I want to challenge you to look for the nuances of each story, and to always look beyond DACA to acknowledge that there's a wide variety of immigrant experiences in this country. Just to close, I mentioned before that I never qualified for DACA. I missed the age requirement by less than 2 years. And under the law, I believed that I did not deserve anything. But the problem is that I truly believed it to my core. I believed that I had no rights. And even worse, that I believed that there was something inherently wrong with me. And it took a very long time of sharing with groups, sharing my story, engaging in therapy, and in other forms of self-care, to start discerning those limiting thoughts that came from, not just from my status, but from my upbringing, my story, and even the messages that I was receiving from the media. So I'm still challenging myself to understand that every day. So I agree with the guide that many undocumented immigrants are not comfortable sharing their story publicly. It took me 8 years to do so. And I think that the story had to make sense to me first before I could share it with everyone. And I truly believe that when somebody discloses their status to me, it is a true honor. Just to end this portion, I just want to share with you that, my family and I still don't qualify for any legal remedies. Some of us live wondering if this country will be our permanent home. Some of my friends, including DACA recipients, have left the country to look for opportunities elsewhere. However, I care deeply about my community and about this place, and whether I make it my permanent home or not, this is where I found my chosen family. And so I share my process with you and with everyone else, so it's useful to someone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marita. We really appreciate you sharing your story with us today. We know that it takes a lot of courage to do that in such a public forum, and we just really appreciate it. Thank you. And I think you wonderfully, through your story, told us about your experiences with mental health and how unique they can be for each person, for each immigrant, for each person who identifies as immigrant, some of the diversity within the undocumented immigrant community, that not everyone qualifies for DACA, and some of the preferences in terms of the terms, right? The term dreamer doesn't apply to everyone. And I think you wonderfully also told us about your own journey with becoming comfortable with sharing your own story. Not everyone who is undocumented is comfortable with it because of the risks, right, associated with it. And thank you so much for telling us about your journey to connecting with community resources and the ways in which connecting with organizations like Immigrants Rising, the UC Berkeley Undocumented Student Program with a therapist, how all of that has been part of your healing process. And so thank you so much. Okay, so we'll move on to the next part where we'll get to hear now Jose Manuel's story. And for this part, we have some questions here to guide this conversation. Jose Manuel, again, as Maritza did it, please remember that this is hopefully a safe space, but that there is an audience, and to share as little or as much as you feel comfortable. And thank you also for sharing your story with us and helping educate us. So, Jose Manuel, I know you are a doctoral student in counseling psychology. I think you are going on your second year, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so do you want to tell us a little bit about how you became interested in psychology?
Yeah, okay. So there were really many different events that got me interested in psychology, but there was one big series of events that really served as a catalyst for my interest, and that was around the end of high school when I went to go see a therapist. And I went for two big reasons, but one of the reasons was that I wanted to talk about my the challenges that I was going through because of my undocumented status. And the first session seemed to be going really well. The therapist was really kind, really warm. But then about halfway through that first session, I brought up my undocumented status and let him know that that's something I really wanted to focus on throughout the rest of therapy. And after that, it got a little quiet. It got a little awkward. It seemed like he had no clue what to say, which, you know, it's understandable. Maybe I was his first undocumented client. And then for the rest of the session, it sort of seemed like he was trying to make sure he doesn't say anything wrong. But again, I figured it was okay because maybe he just didn't know how to work with undocumented people yet. But then in the next sessions, whenever I would try to bring up my undocumented experience again, he would just completely dismiss that and try to guide the conversation more to the symptoms that I was experiencing rather than to listen to my undocumented experience. And so no matter how hard I was trying to guide the conversation towards the topic that I wanted to talk about, he kept bringing it back to the symptoms. So after like about 5 sessions or so, I just stopped going because I figured we just weren't a match for each other. And after leaving that last session, I thought to myself, you know, if I am not feeling fully listened to or understood by a therapist, then there must be other undocumented people who have experienced the same thing or who will experience the same thing. And that just did not sit well with me. And so I told myself that day, if I could just change one thing in my life, it would be how psychologists treat and work with undocumented people. And so that day is the day that I really decided that psychology is something that I'm very passionate about. And so after I decided that, I went to do some research to see what was required to become a psychologist. And this goes well into the next question about my journey to the PhD program. Because you see, when I did research on what I needed to do to become a psychologist, I saw that I needed this thing called a PhD. And I had no clue what that was. And I also didn't have anyone to ask what a PhD was or what happens once you get in, what requirements you need to get in. It was all just a complete mystery to me. But my undergrad had various workshops that talked about graduate programs in clinical and counseling psychology, so I tried to attend all the ones that I possibly could. And they were all hosted by different representatives of different schools. And honestly, I always felt like I left a little bit more confused than I did when I went in. And that's because they seemed to talk about graduate school in a way where they kind of expected you to have some sort of basic understanding of what graduate school was. So they would talk about internships and practicums, kind of expecting you to know what they were, but at the time I had no clue. And everyone else seemed, from what I perceived, they seemed to know what those concepts were, so I was too afraid to ask any questions. But at the end of every workshop, I would wait until everyone leaves, so then I could ask the different speakers the same question. I would ask, how does the application process look like for an undocumented student? And I would always get a very similar answer. They would always say something like, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question. I just haven't heard of that happen before at my school. And that answer always stung. It always hurt and left me a little demoralized, honestly. But I'm a very stubborn person, and so when I set my mind to something, I just have to do it. I told myself that even if I have to be the first undocumented psychologist, that's okay. I'm going to find a way to do it. To be clear, I'm not the first one. Just want to put that out there. But at the time, I didn't know. And this goes well into the next question about how mentoring played a role in my professional path, because it wasn't until I met my 3 mentors that I really found out what graduate school really is and what being a psychologist consists of. And I could create a whole presentation on everything my mentors did for me, but I don't want to take up so much time. So I'll just mention that even though they had very different mentoring styles, they had 3 big things in common. One is that they would meet me at where I'm at. And what I mean by that is that they would make space for me to ask all the abundance of questions I had for them regarding graduate school, no matter how many I asked. And they would always give me very detailed and enthusiastic answers. And then 2, when I did ask questions that they didn't know the answer to, like how does the application process look like for undocumented people, they wouldn't just stop at, oh, I don't know the answer to that. They would go further and say, I don't know the answer to that right now, but let me use my social capital and my resources to try to find an answer for you. And they always did. And then 3, they also gave me opportunities to improve my research abilities. They wouldn't just give me the monotonous research tasks that undergraduate research assistants typically get. They would give me more advanced roles and explain to me how those roles would help me develop my research abilities and how they would prepare me to succeed in graduate school. And I just want to mention that even now that I'm in graduate school, mentorship has really played a big role in my life. My advisor and mentor has continued to support me in every way this year to make sure that I develop the skills that I need to become the psychologist that I want to be, and also to make sure that I feel safe in Utah, because it's a very conservative place, as you may or may not know. And all of this really boils down to advocating. So my recommendation for you is, if you want to mentor undocumented students, advocate for them, for their well-being, and also for the goals that they have. And now to answer that last question about what kinds of professional supports do I think mental health providers need to better serve undocumented people. While I was thinking about this one, I was having a lot of trouble because there's so many possibilities that we could do. But as I was talking to my advisor and to Germán, I thought that there's 3 key things that we could do right now. And one is having more research on this community. There's a complete lack of research on this community, and we also can't depend on research from 20 years ago to understand the current undocumented experience, because as you may know, immigration policies change so rapidly. Like in 2012, when DACA passed, that changed the lives of many undocumented people. So we need to keep up with those policies, and also with the current context and current immigrant sentiments in this country. And then 2, we need more strength-based interventions and approaches. We're too focused on the symptoms, the weaknesses, the illnesses. But as you know, the absence of illness does not equal well-being. So we need to start focusing on the strengths of the undocumented community and really use those strengths to empower them. And then three, my bad. We need more trainings like this one. You can't expect to go to a 3-part series like this one and know everything you need to know about how to work with undocumented people. We need more, and you need to keep up with the trainings because, like I said, immigration policies and sentiments change so fast, so we need to keep up with undocumented people. And I could talk about these all day, really, so if you want me to elaborate them further, please feel free to email me. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jose Manuel, for sharing your story, for sharing so openly, and again, also for your courage to share in such a public platform, right? It sounds like you wanted to inform the way that psychologists work so that other people don't have to go through what you went through, feeling invalidated or being pathologized by a therapist. And I just want to highlight that you're doing that now. You're here, and you're hopefully informing the way that psychologists can work in a better, more culturally competent way. That's really remarkable that you got there. I also wanted to point out both you and Maritza, just how remarkable your journeys are, and that that you were able to get your education, your college education. I know that Maritza is almost done at UC Berkeley, and Jose Manuel, you're pursuing your doctorate. And not that your educational achievements, define you, right, or justify your humanity, because you should have human rights just for being a person. But it's really remarkable knowing that only 2% of all college students are undocumented. And of those, only between 1% and 5% actually get to graduate because of the incredible systemic barriers in the way. So I just want to acknowledge that and again, congratulate you on all of your everything that you do, both of you. Thank you for that, Jose. Anything else that you would like to share before we move on?
I'm not sure. I mean, if the audience has any questions, feel free to ask away.
Absolutely. Yes, please. If there are questions, please type them on the chat, and we'll get to the Q&A in just a few minutes. Wonderful. So we have a couple of recommendations building on what Jose Manuel said, what Maritza said about their own mental health experiences as people who are undocumented or who may hold DACA, and also some of the models that Lily shared with us earlier. And one of these recommendations for providers, particularly for providers who hold identities where we experience marginalization in a similar way as our clients, is to engage in radical healing. And radical healing is a new framework. It was actually published this year by French and colleagues, and it addresses both social oppression and also justice and liberation, and what we can do with our clients and ourselves in order to get to a point of healing from social oppression. So they note that it is important for providers to and for clients to have a sense of emotional and social support. I know that for me, personally, that was key when I was providing clinical services. I needed to know that I had social supports for my own trauma, for experiencing my own traumatization, that I was engaging in strength-based kind of community work and also resistance kind of community work in order to address the changing policy around immigration, and in order to address all of the anti-immigrant hate. And that was important for me, as many of the presenters today have highlighted that's been important to them too. To engage in critical consciousness, to continue to learn about the ways in which systems of oppressions impacts our own well-being, and to become more conscious, more aware of that. To engage in cultural authenticity and self-knowledge, to understand our own cultural background a bit more, to explore our own identities and to bring that into our work. And finally, to maintain hope, to maintain a sense of radical hope. So I leave this there for anyone who experiences any marginalization that is similar to their clients. I think we also need to take care of ourselves in order to work with immigrant communities. A couple more recommendations for providers. We actually this is actually required for all of us from the ethical codes, right, in APA, where we need to evaluate our competence on an ongoing basis. So I think it's important as providers to make sure that we assess whether we are a good fit for a particular client at any point. And if we're not, if maybe the presenting concern, including everything related to immigration, is beyond our level of competence, to then try to seek to improve our competencies, right, through education and training, like these kinds of educational opportunities, or to refer the client to someone who might be able to work with them. And to engage in continuing education, to engage in supervision, consultation, as needed in doing this kind of work that is very trauma heavy, and where there are so many sociopolitical changes, that definitely having professional support is a must in order to do this work, and to engage in self-care, right? And then the last thing before we move into the Q&A, we have some resources here that we'd like to share with providers, educators, and scholars in the audience. On the left-hand side, we have the Informed Immigrant Platform, and this is a wonderful compilation of resources that are free, available to the community of immigrants themselves, but also to providers, to service providers and educators. Many of these resources are also in Spanish. There's even a tool for finding legal support all across the country for finding pro bono and free legal supports. So highly recommend this resource. And this is where our guide for providing mental health services, this is where it's housed. And so if anybody's interested in reading our guide, you can go there. Here in the middle, we have Nlpa, which is an amazing community of psychologists who are Latinx or who focus on Latinx issues. And within this association, there is a group for undocumented immigrant issues. We're working on multiple projects, working with community organizations. And so sometimes those professional associations can really be an outlet for advocacy and an outlet for working with the community. And in a similar way as Nlpa, there are also other ethnic minority associations, including associations for Black psychologists, for Asian American psychologists, for psychologists from the Middle East. And so joining these professional groups can be a really excellent way of finding support and having an outlet for advocacy. At the top, we have Latinx therapists. Latinx therapies, which is a directory of psychologists who provide culturally responsive services. And they also have many wonderful continuing education resources for providers on how to continue to provide culturally sensitive, culturally responsive services. And then on the bottom right, we have the National Immigration Law Center, which is, again, a wonderful resource for following immigration policy and staying up to date with so many changes, right? Just in the last month, we've had a number of changes. There was a victory with the DACA case. We have the backlash to that. we had an attempt to limit international students. There's just been so much, right, that as a provider it can be overwhelming to even know where to start. And the National Immigration Law Center could be a good place for a digest of all of these immigration policy changes. Okay, so with that, let's go into the Q&A.
Okay, I'll just remind everybody you can ask your questions now in the Q&A tab you find on your screen. The first question I have for you is asking, was there something preventing you from seeking citizenship?
Thank you. And that might have been a question for Maritza or for Jose Manuel. So if either or both of you want to answer that, yeah, and this is a good opportunity to maybe inform anyone who maybe is not familiar with the immigration system that seeking citizenship is actually not simply about asking, right, or submitting an application, but that there are a number of barriers in the way that prevent so many people from being able to obtain legal status, which is the reason why we have 11 million undocumented immigrants who don't have legal status.
So I can try to talk a little bit about that. So first, I would highly encourage you to do a little research about what the citizenship or the naturalization process looks like for most people. But for me personally, I did go to an immigration lawyer to ask if there's any possible way that I could apply for citizenship. And this was 2 years ago, so pretty recent. And she tried her best to look for any loophole, but it turned out there's no possible way for me to apply for citizenship right now unless I marry someone with citizenship, because the naturalization process is just so complicated. There's too many barriers in my path for me to apply. So that's why I haven't applied.
Yeah, I'm going to second that. I have been very active on looking for legal advice pretty much since I got here. So as I mentioned, I've been here for 23 years. I have probably consulted more than 10 different immigration lawyers, asking absolutely everyone. We have explored, family petition. We have explored different types of visas through entrepreneurship, through career, through many other ways, and there's really no legal remedies for me and my family. So same thing, like the only path for me would be through marriage, which is something that I'm not ready to do.
Yeah, I will also comment that I had a similar experience to both of you. When I was undocumented, there was simply, for me and my family, there was just no path. We talked to attorneys, and there was simply no way of us as a family being able to apply and to obtain legal status. I don't think anybody is undocumented because they want to be, right? I think if people could have a pathway to getting those protections, they probably would apply, right? Like both of you shared. For me, it wasn't until I got very lucky and I happened to fall in love with somebody who was a U.S. citizen. It was through that way that I eventually obtained permanent residency and eventually citizenship. But I was very lucky because even through that pathway, it depends on how somebody entered, how they immigrated into the country, and it's on a case-by-case basis. And we know that in the past few years, all of those avenues have been closing and have been becoming more and more limited because of the constant attacks on immigration policies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll just, I can certainly relate to everything that you've all shared in terms of every every person's case is unique. Me personally, my family was able to qualify under a U visa, which is for survivors of a particular crime. But that actually, we didn't learn about that until numerous explorations with various immigration attorneys. It was also a very lengthy process. It was an incredibly traumatic process for my family and I. So even going through a process in and of itself can create a lot of stress and anxiety and trauma. So again, right, even as we're thinking about working with different clients and different individuals that are meeting with different immigration attorneys, also just recognizing that even the idea, right, of going into an immigration office or speaking to an immigration attorney about your story can definitely bring up a lot of different things. But yeah, definitely can't emphasize enough that every story and every case is different, and also just the importance of also just encouraging folks to seek out legal assistance continuously, right? Because you know, things can certainly change for folks and where they're at in discussing different experiences maybe that they've had.
Lily, I want to build on that a little bit, and I'm sorry that the process was traumatic for you. It is not uncommon for people who are trying to find some kind of legal pathway to experience some re-traumatization in having to retell their story to an attorney. And so infusing trauma-informed kind of care into legal services, you know, is an area of need for anyone who's interested in doing that. But I just want to highlight that as psychologists and mental health providers, there are times when we may be able to collaborate with attorneys to ensure that our evaluations, our assessments are included in legal cases, and sometimes that can be helpful to clients. And I had the opportunity of doing that when I was working as a postdoc at UC Berkeley. Okay, so I think we can go to the next question.
Certainly. Question is there anything counselors can do outside of listening to stories and recognizing undocumented status to make their immigrants clients, feel more comfortable? Can you read that again? I will. You may have lost your sound again. Can anyone take that question, possibly?
And anyone who would like to jump in?
Yeah, I have some ideas. I think that making your support visible through posters of art, being as making your support visible as possible. Immigrants Rising actually has under resources. They have a section of artworks in relationship. It's called Art and Empowerment, and this is and there are many artists that just illustrate the support for the undocumented community, the immigrant community. So honestly, sometimes adding a sticker or adding something on your website to make your support visible, I think that's been very helpful, and also warms my heart every time I see it in somebody's office. So that is only one idea.
I would like to add that I really like that idea. I do appreciate when I see the stickers that says like Undocu Ally or something like that. I really like that. makes me feel like I'm in a comfortable space. I think another thing, like I mentioned earlier, is to focus on our strengths. I think that would help a lot in therapy if you just focus on the undocumented client's strengths, talk about them, reiterate them to them, and just empower them using those strengths.
All right, I'm going to go to one final question that looks like we have time for. It looks like this one is for you, Jose. It's when President Trump was giving an order to deport international students as universities were going virtual, would it have affected you?
No, I don't think so. I think from what I understood of the policy, it only applied to international students that had specific visas, and I don't have any visa, so it wouldn't have applied to me.
Okay, thank you. And it
was
does
so
actually
scary, though.
It does look like we can probably squeeze in another question, and this one looks like it's addressed to Marita. Any thought of becoming an art therapist?
Not until this point, but I might need to consider it.
Okay.
Maritza, I definitely can see it.
All right, I'll go with one more then. How do you find yourselves able to sustain and promote radical hope in the face of systemic sociopolitical oppression? Shall I repeat, or Dr. Cadenas, are you there?
Yes, I can take it unless somebody else would like to jump in first. Yeah, I think for me personally, there's no other choice, right? And I just think back to even more difficult times that I've been through as an undocumented immigrant, and that just gives me hope. And I think that thinking about my family and thinking about our community and our resilience, that gives me hope. And also thinking about our historical struggle, like Lily mentioned earlier, thinking about colonization, thinking about slavery, thinking about so many historical events that have impacted communities of color, and we have survived them. We have made it this far through centuries and centuries of oppression, and I am completely confident that we will be here for a while. Anybody else who would like to share how you maintain hope?
I don't want to talk too much, but I guess I can go. So something that keeps me hopeful is just learning from the past advocates. So there was a bunch of advocates before DACA passed that were really pushing for Obama to do something to help our community. And because of those advocates, Obama ended up passing DACA. So thinking of moments like that motivate me to stay hopeful that some way, somehow, we just keep advocating for undocumented people, we're going to create some sort of change.
Well, that looks like all our questions and the time we have. Any final remarks before we wrap up?
No, I just want to thank the audience for being here with us today. And please feel free to contact us with any questions or if we can be of any support. I don't know if Marita, Lily, anything you would like to say? Jose Manuel?
Just want to say thank you so much.
All right, then. Thanks, everybody. And that is all the time we have for the webinar today. On behalf of the APA, we would like to thank our presenters for today's presentation. Of course, we would also like to thank you for tuning in to today's program. Remember, to receive continuing education credit, please do complete the evaluation. You will receive your documentation of CE credits soon after. Again, this does conclude today's presentation. Thank you so much for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day.